Have you ever stopped to imagine what it feels like to be surrounded by food that you can't touch, to see water just out of reach, to smell bread but never taste it? Hunger has always been one of the cruelest forms of suffering. But what happens when hunger isn't just an accident of nature? What happens when it's used deliberately as a weapon? That question is at the heart of the story we are about to uncover. Welcome to World's Echoes. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because in this space we explore the echoes of human stories that travel across borders, across oceans, and across time itself. Yesterday, something happened on the sea. A flotilla, a convoy of ships carrying food, medicine, and basic supplies, was stopped. Not because it carried weapons. Not because it was dangerous. It was stopped simply because it carried the things that keep people alive. It carried bread, rice, clean water, and medicine. Ordinary things you and I take for granted every single day. But to some people, these ordinary things are miracles. And yesterday, those miracles were blocked. Think about that for a moment. The very things that should never be political, that should never be controversial, the things that are at the foundation of human life, food, water, survival, are now treated like contraband. When you deny a child food, when you stop a family from getting clean water, you're not just controlling supplies. You're controlling life itself. And history tells us this is one of the oldest and most devastating weapons of war. Let's take a step back. Wars have been fought with swords, with guns, with bombs. But just as powerful, sometimes more powerful, has been the quiet weapon of starvation. Castles in the Middle Ages were not always taken by force, they were taken by siege. Armies would surround a city, cut off the food, poison the wells, and wait. The people inside would suffer. First, they would ration. Then they would beg. And eventually, they would surrender, not because the walls fell, but because their stomachs did. The terrifying truth is that this ancient method is still alive today. Only now, instead of walls and castles, it is borders and checkpoints. Instead of soldiers with torches, it is governments with policies. And yesterday's flotilla is not the first time the sea carried hope that was turned away. Decades of history echo with similar stories. Stories where the lifeline of food was cut, where survival itself was politicized. Imagine the people waiting on shore. Mothers who know the ships are coming. Fathers who tell their children, "Tonight, you will eat." Children who dream of sweet fruit, of clean water, of something other than hunger. And then, silence. No ship. No supplies. Only hunger again. That is the kind of cruelty that cuts deeper than any sword or bomb. Because while a bomb destroys in an instant, hunger destroys slowly. It kills by the hour. And it is not just about physical pain. Hunger takes away dignity. It makes people beg when they should be free. It makes them fight over scraps when they should have enough. It breaks down communities, turning neighbor against neighbor. It destroys hope itself. And that is why stopping food is more than just an act of control. It is a weapon aimed not at armies, but at humanity itself. But why is this happening now? Why, in a world where we produce more food than ever before, are ships carrying basic supplies being stopped at sea? To answer that, we have to understand not just this incident, but the long, painful history of food as a weapon. From ancient wars to modern conflicts, food has been manipulated, restricted, and blocked. Sometimes as punishment. Sometimes as strategy. And always at the cost of the innocent. In World War II, the siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Nearly 1 million civilians died, not from bombs, but from starvation. The German army surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies. People ate bread made of sawdust. They boiled leather to survive. Families starved in silence, waiting for help that came too late. That was one of the deadliest examples of food used as a weapon. But history didn't end there. In Biafra, in the late 1960s, starvation was used deliberately in the Nigerian Civil War. In Yemen, just in recent years, blockades have stopped medicine and food, leading to what the UN has called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And now, here we are again. A flotilla, a convoy of hope, stopped in the middle of the sea. Arrested not because of danger, but because of politics. Think about the symbolism here. The sea is supposed to connect us. Oceans have always been the highways of trade, the lifelines of survival. Salt, spices, rice, sugar, all of these traveled by sea to feed the world. But now, that same sea has become a wall. A wall that says, you may not eat. A wall that says, your suffering is not accidental, it is chosen. And this brings us to the deepest question of all. What kind of world are we building, where feeding the hungry is seen as a crime? Where water is blocked, where bread is denied, where survival itself is used as leverage? If we allow food to be politicized, if we allow hunger to become a tool of control, then none of us are safe. Because hunger knows no borders. Today it is them. Tomorrow it could be us. This story is not just about a flotilla. It's about the fragile line between survival and politics. It's about whether we see food as a right or as a privilege. And it's about whether we, as a global community, will accept hunger as a weapon or reject it as the ultimate act of cruelty. And so, as you listen to this story unfold, I want to ask you to hold one thought in your mind. Imagine your own table tonight. Imagine your meal, your drink, your family gathered around. Now imagine someone telling you, no. You cannot eat. You cannot drink. You cannot live. That is the reality for millions today. And that is why this flotilla matters. When we talk about war, most of us imagine explosions, soldiers in uniform, tanks rolling across landscapes. But the cruelest weapon is often invisible. It doesn't explode. It doesn't leave craters. It creeps in quietly, through empty plates, through dry wells, through children's hollow eyes. That's what makes it so powerful. You don't always hear it, but you feel it, slowly, unbearably, until it breaks a person down. The flotilla that was stopped this week is not just a ship, it is a symbol. A floating reminder that human beings are capable of both extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty. On board were volunteers, activists, people from different countries who were not carrying guns or flags, but sacks of rice, bottles of clean water, boxes of medicine. Simple, ordinary items. Yet those simple items threatened powerful systems. They threatened the idea that control is more important than compassion. And so, the ships were stopped. But this has happened before. In 2010, a flotilla carrying humanitarian aid was also stopped violently, leading to deaths and international outrage. Back then, the world watched, shocked, as activists carrying food were treated like enemies. And yet here we are, 15 years later, watching the same story unfold again. The echoes of history repeating, as though humanity hasn't learned. Why is food such a dangerous weapon? Because it cuts across every barrier. We might not all speak the same language. We might not all follow the same beliefs. But hunger speaks one universal tongue. Everyone knows what it means to be hungry. Everyone knows what it feels like to thirst. That's why denying food is more than strategy, it's cruelty that touches the most basic human instinct. Survival. Think about this, when food becomes a weapon, the battlefield is not fought between soldiers, but inside the bodies of civilians. The battlefield is a child's stomach. It is an old woman's bones. It is the slow shrinking of life until nothing remains but silence. And in that silence, power wins. The world has seen this again and again. During the Great Irish Famine in the 1840s, millions starved not because there was no food at all, but because food was exported away while the people who grew it were left to suffer. In Ethiopia, during the 1980s famine, food aid was blocked and manipulated by politics, turning starvation into a tool of war. In Yemen today, fuel blockades and restricted imports mean hospitals cannot run and children die of malnutrition before they ever see their 5th birthday. Every time we hear these stories, there is outrage. Protests. Speeches at the United Nations. But then, slowly, the world moves on. The cameras leave. The politicians forget. And the people remain, still hungry, still waiting. That's why this flotilla matters. It's not just about food, it's about memory. It forces us to remember what too many would rather forget. Now, close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are standing on a dock. In the distance, you see ships approaching. You know what's inside them. Food. Clean water. Medicine for your sick mother. Milk for your baby. And for a brief moment, hope floods your heart. Maybe tonight will be different. Maybe tonight you will eat. Maybe your child will drink milk instead of muddy water. But as the ships draw closer, you hear the news: they have been stopped. Arrested. Taken away. The hope that bloomed in your chest dies before it even takes root. That is what it feels like when food is used as a weapon. It is hope itself being strangled. And here is the terrible truth: starving people into submission has always been a shortcut in war. It is easier than fighting an enemy army. You don't need bullets when you can make people so weak they cannot resist. You don't need to destroy walls when you can destroy crops. The land becomes barren, and with it, so do the people. That is why sieges were so common in ancient warfare, and why, tragically, they remain common today. But what is different now is that the world is watching. Every act, every blockade, every denied shipment is seen instantly across the globe. And yet, despite the knowledge, despite the outrage, it still happens. That raises the question: what is stronger, our compassion, or our politics? Let's pause for just a second and reflect. Imagine if the same thing happened in your town. Imagine if, tomorrow, the grocery stores were locked. Trucks carrying food were stopped at the border. Clean water was blocked from entering your city. How long would it take before hunger spread? How long before desperation turned your neighbors into enemies, fighting over scraps of bread? That is the silent war people are living through right now. The flotilla is not just a story of ships, it is a mirror. It forces us to look at ourselves and ask, how did we allow this? How did we reach a point where feeding the hungry is criminalized? We live in a world where one country throws away millions of tons of food every year while another starves. Where supermarkets overflow with produce, while aid convoys are blocked at borders. The imbalance is not just unfair, it is inhuman. This story is not comfortable to hear. But that is exactly why it needs to be told. Because silence is what makes these blockades possible. Silence allows hunger to become normal. And if we allow that, then what does it say about us as a species? About the value we place on life itself? And so we return to the sea. To the image of those ships stopped in their tracks. To the volunteers who risked everything, not for glory, not for power, but simply to deliver food. Their courage shines against the backdrop of cruelty. And while they were arrested, while the supplies were seized, their message still sails across the waves, that humanity is greater than politics, and compassion is stronger than control. Because in the end, hunger will not disappear through blockades or policies. Hunger will only disappear when we choose to feed, when we choose to open doors instead of closing them, when we see food not as a weapon but as a right. That is the truth at the heart of the flotilla story. A truth that demands we do not look away. There's something haunting about the image of a ship stopped at sea. Ships are supposed to move, to connect, to bridge distances. For thousands of years, ships have carried life across oceans: food, medicine, families, ideas, even dreams. To stop a ship filled not with weapons but with bread and water feels like an assault not only on the people waiting for it, but on the very idea of connection itself. The sea was never meant to be a barrier. It was always meant to be a passage, a path toward survival and exchange. Salt traveled across oceans. Spices fueled entire economies. Wheat and rice fed empires. And in our modern age, container ships carry the goods that keep our shelves stocked, our fridges full, our homes alive. To suddenly say, this ship may not pass, because what it carries is too dangerous even though it carries nothing more than survival itself, that is a contradiction so staggering it almost feels surreal. But surreal is often the word that people trapped in hunger use to describe their lives. Surreal to wake up in the morning and wonder if you will eat that day. Surreal to watch your children grow thinner while you can do nothing. Surreal to live in a world overflowing with abundance, yet be denied a single loaf of bread. That's the paradox the flotilla incident exposes, the abundance of the world versus the artificial scarcity imposed by politics. Let's imagine one of the volunteers on that flotilla. Maybe a teacher from Europe, who left behind her classroom to bring food to children she would never meet. Maybe a retired doctor from South America, who believed that saving lives should have no borders. Maybe a student from the United States, inspired by the idea that no one should starve in the 21st century. These people were not soldiers. They were ordinary human beings acting out of extraordinary compassion. Yet they were treated as criminals. Their crime? Bringing food. Carrying hope. And that is the irony. A loaf of bread in one country is ordinary. It's something we throw away when it gets stale. But the same loaf of bread in another country is dangerous. It's treated as contraband. How strange, that the same object can shift meaning depending on who is allowed to eat it. How strange, that food is something meant to unite us is twisted into a weapon that divides us. History echoes with examples. The Berlin airlift of 1948 was one of the rare moments when humanity resisted the use of hunger as a weapon. When the Soviet Union cut off food and supplies to West Berlin, the city was on the brink of starvation. And then, in an act of defiance and compassion, American and British pilots began flying in food, fuel, and medicine. Day after day, plane after plane, they dropped not bombs but bread. And in that moment, the sky became a highway of hope. The blockade failed because compassion was stronger than control. But not every blockade has been met with such defiance. In too many cases, the world watched as hunger spread unchecked. In too many cases, silence allowed cruelty to triumph. The flotilla today challenges us to ask, which side of history will we stand on? Will we be like the airlift pilots, choosing compassion over politics? Or will we be like the silent onlookers, turning our faces away as hunger tightens its grip? And here's the hardest part to admit, hunger as a weapon works. It breaks people down. It makes them surrender. It forces them to accept what they would otherwise resist. That's why it's used. That's why ships are stopped. That's why blockades are enforced. It's not because food is dangerous. It's because food is powerful. But the power of food cuts both ways. Yes, it can be turned into a weapon. But it can also be turned into resistance. Every loaf of bread delivered, every sack of rice shared, every bottle of water passed hand to hand is an act of defiance against cruelty. That's what made those volunteers board the flotilla. That's why they risked arrest. Because they understood something simple, feeding the hungry is one of the most powerful statements you can make. It says, I see you. I care about you. Your life matters. And that's a message stronger than any blockade. Let's pause here, and I want to ask you something. If you could send just one item on a ship like that, knowing it would reach a starving family, what would it be? A bag of rice? A box of medicine? A bottle of clean water? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments, because that one choice says a lot about what we value most as human beings. Now, let's return to the families on shore. In their silence, in their waiting, they teach us a lesson we often forget. Survival is not just about food. It's about dignity. To be forced to wait for food, to see it taken away, to be told your hunger is political, that is a deep wound. It's a wound that lasts even after the stomach is full again. Hunger steals more than calories. It steals hope. It steals time. It steals the joy of life itself. Think of the child whose growth is stunted because of malnutrition. Even if food arrives later, that child's future has already been altered forever. Think of the mother who buries her baby because milk was blocked at a border. No later delivery can undo that. This is why hunger is the cruelest weapon, because its wounds do not heal easily. They echo for generations. And yet, in the midst of all this, there is still resilience. There are still people who cook meals out of almost nothing, who share their last piece of bread with a neighbor, who plant seeds even when they know the harvest might be destroyed. Humanity refuses to give up. And that refusal is a kind of power that no blockade can fully erase. So, when a flotilla sails, it carries more than food. It carries the idea that compassion can cross any sea, that dignity can be restored, that humanity has not yet surrendered. That's why it matters so deeply when a flotilla is stopped. It's not just the loss of food. It's the attempt to kill hope itself. And that, perhaps, is the most frightening thing of all. Because hunger weakens the body, but hopelessness weakens the soul. And when people lose hope, the world loses something irreplaceable. Every time I think about this flotilla, I keep coming back to the same image: people waiting. Waiting on the shore, waiting in homes, waiting in hospitals. Waiting for the sound of ships that never arrive. Waiting for help that is turned away. Hunger makes time move differently. Every minute feels longer, every hour feels heavier. For the people waiting, hunger stretches days into lifetimes. And yet, around the world, others continue with their lives, barely noticing. We eat, we drink, we waste food without thinking. That contrast, the abundance in one part of the world, and the emptiness in another, is almost too much to comprehend. But that's the cruel power of distance. It allows us to ignore. It allows us to believe that hunger belongs to someone else, somewhere else, far away. But hunger is not far away. It is one of the most universal human conditions, and it is closer than we think. Even in wealthy nations, there are families who quietly struggle with empty fridges. Even in cities full of lights and supermarkets, there are children who go to bed hungry. It may not look like the blockades we see overseas, but it is connected. Because at its core, hunger is always about power. The power to distribute, to deny, to allow, to forbid. That is why this flotilla is not just a local story. It is global. It is about every community where survival is politicized, where food is not seen as a right but as a privilege. And that brings us to a bigger question: what does it mean to be human? Is it to build walls, or to break them? Is it to hoard, or to share? Is it to stop ships, or to sail them forward? History will not remember the names of every politician who enforced a blockade. But history will remember the images: the starving child, the seized ship, the silenced hope. And it will remember, too, the people who tried to resist that silence. The pilots of the Berlin airlift. The volunteers on the flotillas. The neighbors who share their last bread. There is a phrase often said: wars start with weapons, but they end with hunger. When guns fall silent, it is always the stomach that decides the future. Because no peace can last if people are starving. No stability can survive if families cannot eat. Denying food may win a battle, but it always loses the war for humanity. The frightening truth is that some leaders know this. They know hunger is the ultimate weapon because it doesn't make noise. It doesn't shock the world with a single blast. Instead, it quietly kills in corners, in shadows, where the cameras do not linger. And yet, the damage is deeper than any bomb. Because hunger doesn't just take life, it takes generations. Now imagine for a moment if the opposite were true. Imagine a world where food was never political. Imagine if every blockade fell, every ship passed, every child ate. Imagine if bread and water were treated not as leverage, but as sacred. How different would our world look? How many wars would dissolve? How many futures would be saved? That is the vision that sailed with the flotilla. That is why people risked their freedom to deliver food. They weren't naive. They knew they might be stopped. They knew they might be arrested. But they also knew that every act of compassion, every sack of rice, every bottle of water carried across a border is an act of defiance against cruelty. And that defiance is powerful. So here we are, at the end of this story, but not at the end of its meaning. The flotilla was stopped. The supplies were seized. The volunteers were arrested. But the story does not end there. Because stories like this ripple outward. They travel across oceans, into living rooms, into hearts. They force us to confront the question we all must answer: what kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want a world where food is a weapon, where water is denied, where survival itself is politicized? Or do we want a world where feeding the hungry is never seen as a crime? That choice is not abstract. It is real. And it is ours. Think of your dinner table tonight. Think of the food in front of you. The simple act of eating is something millions cannot do. But it is also something we can choose to share. One loaf of bread, one act of generosity, one refusal to accept hunger as normal, these are the building blocks of a different future. Because the truth is this, hunger is man-made. We produce enough food to feed every person on this planet. The problem is not supply. It is distribution. It is politics. It is the decision to use food as power, rather than as life. And if human beings can create hunger, then human beings can end it. That is the hope hidden even in the darkest blockade. The flotilla may have been stopped at sea, but its message still arrives on our shores. It whispers to us, choose compassion over control. Choose dignity over cruelty. Choose to feed, not to starve. And maybe one day, when our children look back, they will not remember the blockades. They will remember the people who refused to accept them. They will remember the ships that sailed anyway, even when the odds were against them. They will remember that humanity, when pushed, chose compassion. That is the echo of this story. And that is why we cannot stay silent. So, as you finish this video, I want you to take a moment and reflect. If you could change one thing about the way our world treats food, what would it be? Would you make it a universal right? Would you stop the waste? Would you break the blockades? Let that question stay with you, because in the end, the fight against hunger is not only fought on ships at sea, it is fought in the choices we make every day. And if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of its truth, I ask you to share it. Share it so others can see. Share it so silence is broken. And if you haven't already, subscribe to World's Echoes, because here we tell the stories that matter not just to one nation, but to all of us. Stories that remind us of what it means to be human. Because food should never be a weapon. Water should never be denied. And survival should never, ever be political. Thank you for watching.